Hello everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Pillar webinar series called Will DeFi Cross the Chasm? Today we'll be covering everything DAO related, including formation, restrictions and limitations, and the impact that regulation has had on that. To introduce myself, I'm Amber, and I've been with Pillar since early 2018, and I represent the company here today as their legal and compliance advisor. I joined Pillar back in its early stages of development, and I was fortunate enough to be through both V1 and V2 launches. I was also heavily involved in the Pillar DAO formation, to which I will later touch on our experiences with moving forward from the traditional company structure to the governance model. I have an incredible panel here with me today to help discuss the legal versus practical challenges of DAOs and also touch on the emerging change regulation has impacted it. To begin, I shall introduce my panel here today. First, we have Andreas, who is founder of the law firm Inleso AG International Legal Solutions. Andreas has experience in assisting technical, commercial companies, with his areas of expertise being in blockchain, digital finance, and regulatory compliance. Andreas, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Amber. Inleso AG is a boutique law firm with 3 attorneys from different jurisdictions, and we cover the areas of fintech and blockchain law, commercial law, corporate law, and compliance. And since 2017, I am also advising Pillar Project AG and Pillar Project Foundation, who have done a very successful ICO in Switzerland.
Amazing, thanks Andreas. And next we have Han, who is founder and CEO of Otonomos. So Otonomos helps clients set up and manage companies in crypto-friendly jurisdictions and form off-chain and on-chain legal entities. So Han, please go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Amber. So yes, we've been helping the crypto blockchain community since the early days, since sort of the Ethereum Foundation, really setting up legal entities around the world. And we've also, because we got so tired of working with the analog layer, we've also tried to put companies on blockchain and sort of do with the filing. And that's happening right now with our Autoco product, which helps people set up in Wyoming and in Delaware. And so going back to sort of the start of the company, after I did a number of ventures in London, we're just here to figure out if people need legal entities in the first place, and if they do, where they should incorporate. And we're trying to make that process a lot simpler. We're based out of Vancouver and kind of going up and down the West Coast a little bit, but our clients are pretty much everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Han. And finally, we have Erik, who is CEO and founder of Shapeshift, which is an international non-custodial crypto platform, who has recently gone through the motion of dissolving its corporate structure and moving to a DAO model. So Erik, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm Erik Voorhees. Yeah, Shapeshift has been around for about 7.5 years. We started in early 2014. And we have always been a centralized entity. We are a Swiss AG corporation with a few subsidiaries in different jurisdictions. And just this past July, we announced that we are completely dissolving that entity and turning into a DAO. So that is a multi-month process that we are now in the middle of. And I'm happy to be here to talk about it.
I'm sure you're going to get plenty of questions off of that. So amazing, thank you guys. So to get to today's discussion, based off that, it's interesting to know that obviously everyone on the call has or is going through a different experience when it comes to DAO creation, formation, and how they've kind of handled moving into a more decentralized environment. So I have a couple talking points lined up, and we'll structure this as more of an open discussion as opposed to an agenda. And then to finish this off, we'll have a panel discussion with a few Q&As. So everyone, please, if you can send in your questions, we will do our best to address them. So to begin, I kind of want to briefly just start addressing my experience with Pillar from moving into a DAO governance model. So obviously over the years, Pillar's tried different methods, such as different structures. We were trying to put decentralization into a practical sense. But obviously as a company, it proved quite difficult. We underwent significant changes in order to empower our users, who are our Pillar governors, and to move this system into a voting system in order to create the Pillar DAO. This did bring a number of challenges with regards to formation. So, I mean, a key issue for us was we were donating to a DAO, which in order to receive a donation, you need to obviously be a legal recognized entity. And in Switzerland, a DAO isn't necessarily, well, isn't considered a legal entity. So that was a challenge that we had to overcome. And then there was also, the formation, taking on board a voting system and voting mindset to be able to maintain and ensure voting is done right and the process is fair. So like many others, we went through a massive learning curve. And I think it's important to note that everyone else in this industry is going through the same kind of challenges, and we're all kind of moving together. So to open this up, I would like to ask the group, but mainly specifically Erik in this case, in what are your experiences with going fully decentralized? So in the corporate structure, to any of the regulatory issues that Shapeshift would have faced?
Yeah. So yeah, we're in that process right now. And right now, I'm sort of living in two worlds. We have the corporate Shapeshift world, which we are trying to dismantle and dissolve. And as a company with 7.5 years of history, there are 1 million contracts we have with other companies. We have our office lease that we have to figure out what to do with. We have bank accounts all over the world, and unwinding all that structure is itself a massive project. And so as that unwinds, the other half of my world is starting to cultivate the DAO, which is just this community of people interested in the product that hold our token, and setting that up so that it is efficient and effective and can help guide where the open source Shapeshift will go as the closed source and corporate Shapeshift gets dismantled. So, one of our early challenges was certainly just conveying to our board and our shareholders and our employees, like, what the hell is a DAO in the first place? And what do you mean we're going to become that? This is something that I knew very little about just a year ago. And so this last year has really been a journey for me. We had a couple employees within the company that were really on top of this stuff and had participated in DAOs and kept talking to us about it. And all of the things in my head that were, like, that's ridiculous, that can't work like that, those things just started falling over one by one. And ultimately what we realized, the reason why we went this direction is because it allows our product, the Shapeshift crypto platform, to be in line with the ethos of crypto itself, to be truly borderless, to be immutable, and to really answer to its base of users. That is how all the best crypto systems work. And if we are a centralized company, we are always at odds with that in some way. And so that's ultimately like the strategic reason we want to go in this path. But we're not decentralized yet. We're just kind of in the middle of it.
So on the back of that, just out of my own curiosity, how did your employees kind of deal with that movement as well? Because obviously working in a structured company, that can come across as quite a culture shock.
Yeah, we have right now about 71 employees. And so when I conveyed this to them, I had already been thinking about it for months. And as an executive team, we had decided we wanted to do this. And so for us, this idea was, thought through, and we were moving forward with it. But the day that the employees heard about it, of course, it's like the first time. And, it's hard to convey to all the employees that, like, everyone's going to lose their jobs. Like, your W-2 salary is ending, but you should be excited about that for X, Y, and Z reason. And so that was definitely a shock. And, there were employees that were confused about that. Some were excited immediately because they've wanted us to move in this direction as a DAO. Some of them were very anxious about it. And some of them were super anxious and worried. And then, like, a week later, thought it was the coolest thing ever. So it was like dropping a hand grenade into everything and just mixing it all up. And you have to be able to embrace some of that chaos if you're going to destroy one structure that your organization has had for years and move into something that is completely unproven, completely untested, and new to all of humanity, basically.
No, exactly. So, like, off of that, what did you find was the most kind of challenging departments of the company or project to kind of decentralize the power over? So, like, I thought we could kind of discuss off of that different methods taken or different kind of structures put in place to satisfy any regulatory requirements, such as, going decentralized with a legal or compliance department or finance? And how did you kind of keep the DAO governance productive?
Yeah, so a lot of the regulation that has applied to us will not apply in a DAO form. And that doesn't mean that a DAO is impermeable to regulation, but it does mean that a lot of the bases of regulations has to do with the entity being regulated. And when that entity doesn't exist, the laws do not have a target to go after. So Shapeshift made a few moves earlier this year to prepare us for this DAO announcement. We had been, from our beginning, a trading partner with our customers. So when someone traded Bitcoin for Litecoin, they would send us Bitcoin and we send them Litecoin, we as in Shapeshift. So we were a counterparty to that trade. That model was what we had forever. And that model was what put us into the money service business category, and ultimately what caused us to have to implement KYC and all the compliance nonsense back in 2018. We stopped trading with customers earlier this year. We integrated decentralized exchanges and stopped our own trading entirely, sort of as a prerequisite to then be able to DAOify. And so by doing that, we removed the entire MSB side of regulation from Shapeshift, regardless of whether we went into the DAO form. And then the DAO form was able to process naturally because we didn't need to be handling crypto transactions in a hot wallet anymore, right? Like there are some things that you can't really decentralize. And so if your company has those things, it can't really be a DAO until you get rid of those things. And that's part of the process is figuring out which parts of your business you don't need anymore so that the rest of it can be decentralized.
Yeah, I think that's also kind of important to note. So there are obviously legal versus practical challenges of a company and what we can and can't do and how far you actually want to take the DAO status of a company. I think, it's quite interesting for a lot of people who don't really know too much about DAOs to understand this, because moving on to probably, Han might be better to kind of discuss this. Obviously, Otonomos currently has 294 on-chain LLCs, as according to your website today. So obviously, where kind of are DAO-friendly jurisdictions and kind of have the options to form a DAO? Obviously, it'd be great to touch on what you said earlier with regards to what's going on with Wyoming right now, being, the world's first legal entity status on a DAO. And if anyone kind of has any insights on if the rest of the US are going to take this on board, obviously both being in the US right now, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Amber. So fascinating stuff there from Erik. Just maybe a step back, when clients come to us, we always, the first question, so they come to us and they kind of go like, where should we incorporate, where we should up? And I always say, hang on a second, do you actually need to incorporate? And they go like, oh, why shouldn't we? I said, well, you may just stay unincorporated. And interestingly, most of them then go, yeah, what about limited liability? And that's really the biggie here in the room. What about limited liability? The problem we're having is that governments have basically monopolized the granting of limited liability. It used to be contractual, just like there was private issuance of money, but governments, together with monopolizing the issuance of fiat, they have also monopolized basically the chartering of companies. Okay, and so you got to register somewhere, you got to have a legal anchor somewhere in order to wrap yourself in that limited liability. And that's what worries a lot of people who do stuff without being incorporated. They kind of go like, well, what if something happens? Now, Erik makes an interesting point. If you don't have a legal entity, who are you going after? I think that works. However, that probably works best if you're pulling a Satoshi. If you can't pull a Satoshi, then if in extreme cases, there may be ways of finding out who are the leads, who are the people behind the project. And the default legal analysis is that if you're not incorporated, you're all unlimited partners in a venture. And so we see that as kind of currently the big risk in going or staying unincorporated as a DAO until, and let's pray this is happening soon, blockchain will be recognized as a jurisdiction in its own right. And I hope I will still live the day and see that, because we used to be able to play God in our own companies and pretty much decide what we wanted to do until government started to weigh in with ever more regs and restrictions. We got to get to a point where it's actually recognized that when you incorporate on blockchain, you are contractually agreeing on limited liability for what you're doing. And I really think that's the key point, and we need to be a little bit patient, but I think we may be getting there, that blockchain will be recognized. Now, there is a couple of intermediate steps. One intermediate step is, I like to think what we're doing with our Autoco product, where you basically use your Ethereum wallet to spin up a company in 6 seconds contractually between a master and the series. You're getting a series LLC in Wyoming and Delaware. And that wallet that you have, and obviously you control through your private key, is the one that's the first member in that LLC. So it's not Amber owning the LLC, it's Amber's wallet owning the LLC, and then maybe further wallet holders. And so as a result of that, everything already lives on that blockchain ledger. And going forward, as you start distributing tokens, let's say Amber, you issue tokens that represent membership in your LLC, blockchain kind of keep tracks of who is a member in your LLC, and you can build from there. But yes, we are hoping for the day that somehow we'll enforce recognition of jurisdiction on blockchain. And I think, in conclusion, the only way to do it will be just the force of numbers. More and more DAOs are being set up without going incorporated, and somehow the legacy world is going to have to accept that the DAO is a limited liability entity, company, association, whatever it may be.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to know that, because obviously I mean, I was quite surprised that obviously the first legal entity status was actually in the US. I mean, the US is always kind of assumed to not be lagging in things like this, but obviously kind of be second to Europe.
Sure.
So it was quite interesting to see that it happened there. Do you think the rest of the US is going to kind of take this on board? Because I know obviously with crypto regulation, each state is kind of taking its own perspective on what they want to do in each state. So do you think the same will be for DAOs?
Look, I'm a diehard European, but I love the US, and I tell you why. I mean, it's awful if you are being under some enforcement because they are draconian, and so SEC, yes, you got to be worried about them. But in terms of what you can do here, and we contrasted with other jurisdictions, even like the much hailed Singapores and so on, you still have a large degree of freedom. For instance, the way you can incorporate a company here, you can still do it without zero KYC. KYC comes further down the line when you get your EIN and you want a bank account, and then the bank will do KYC on you. But actually, incorporation is super smooth, super quick. And so I do like some of these experiments that come out, especially out of Wyoming. There's a little bit of PR there with that DAO legal entity, because we personally think that it forces people who already have an LLC to then declare that they want to be a DAO, but you could actually be a DAO without making that declaration. So you always got to be a little bit sort of wary about governments wanting to sanction what's already spontaneously happening. But we like what's happening, and we contrast that, for instance, with a Singapore, a Hong Kong, which used to be fantastic jurisdiction, and we're just regs after regs and tick boxes after tick boxes way in. And Switzerland too, you know, we helped the Ethereum Foundation. And if you were to ask Vitalik now, I think he really regrets ever having set up a foundation in Switzerland. It's full of restrictions. No offense, Andreas, but it is a pretty restrictive vehicle. And so, you know, the US is probably, in terms of company formation and what you can do, it's probably sort of the Wild West in crypto land, except token issuance, because that's a whole different kind of worms with security versus non-security, etc.
So, I mean, well, off the back of that, I think we can kind of lead into a question there for Andreas, obviously, because this is very relevant to Pillar's current situation in kind of what are the differences with starting off as a DAO versus kind of turning a company or a foundation into a DAO, and what that process looks like, obviously the limitations that are attached there.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. We have heard already from Erik about the challenges converting a limited liability company. Now, converting an existing Swiss foundation, such as Pillar Project Foundation, into a DAO would be at least as challenging, if not more so. First of all, foundations are subject to so-called solidification principle. That means that the founders will document it in the foundation statutes, solidifies in the form of the purpose at the time of establishment. So once established, the purpose of the foundation can only be changed in exceptional cases under very restrictive conditions. The reservation of a reservation of purpose can be made, but the purpose can only be made, a change can only be made 10 years after establishment at the earliest. So therefore, when you're looking for the wording of the purpose, you have to be very, very careful what is to be achieved with the foundation. And if the purpose has not been worded from the outset with the objective of a DAO in mind, it's difficult to adjust it later. And second, foundations are subject to supervision. Most foundations which are from the classical crypto business are subject to direct supervision of the Federal Supervisory Authority for Foundations. And thirdly, foundations are subject to an audit obligation, and the management body, the foundation board, which cannot form its own will, but must always only be guided by the will of the founder at the time of the establishment, has to report regularly to the supervisory authority on the activities of the foundation. Now, all these 3 points not only raise doubts as to whether a foundation can be subsequently converted to a DAO, but they raise to me the fundamental question whether a foundation is a suitable legal form for a DAO in the first place, and whether there are not any other legal forms that are more suitable. And the one that comes to mind would be a Swiss association. Swiss association is, number one, a very well-established legal entity for non-profit activities. Swiss civil code is both liberal and flexible regarding the formation and the governance of associations. To start an association, you just need 2 natural or legal entities, 2 natural persons or 2 legal entities as the members. The association is established in an organizational meeting that is called to approve the articles of association and to appoint its board members. It requires only a general assembly and an association board, and each member has 1 vote. There is no seat capital required. There's no capital related voting rights. So, and at the same time, the association is an independent legal entity. Therefore, the members of the association are not personally liable. So also in Switzerland, in contrast to other countries, an association does not have to be registered unless it conducts a commercial operation or is subject to audit requirements, which is only the case if the association has more than 10 million assets or a turnover of more than 20 million. And so that, in my opinion, makes an association a more suitable legal form for a DAO than the foundation.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
So I find it strange to think of a DAO as needing or even being compatible with any entity of any kind. I mean, to me, if there is an entity, it is not a DAO. A DAO can only exist in the space where no entity exists. So for a DAO to register, because it is no longer a DAO anymore. It is just the entity that has been registered. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I understand your point. The question that comes to my mind then is, what about liability? If the DAO doesn't have any contact to the outside world, then I would think you don't need any legal form at all, and the DAO can exist without any legal form. But if you want to have or need to have contact to the outside world, if you want to implement a project, if the DAO has and owns assets, like for example in the pillar case where we wanted to give tokens to the DAO, so how do you do that? And the DAO is supposed to use the tokens to implement projects, maybe to pay third-party providers, or and then comes the question, how do you do that without having any legal entity and being a partnership with full liability. That's why my thinking goes towards a kind of legal form, at least if you want to have or need to have contact to the outside world. Now, whether an association is the best legal form or not, that's up to debate. But without any legal form, I think you would face sooner or later an issue if the DAO owns assets and has contact to the outside world.
Yeah, so
I think.
Go ahead.
Now, Erik, I just want to say conceptually, I think you're absolutely right. We want to keep that mental hygiene to say the moment you wrap a DAO in a legal entity, it's probably not longer a DAO. You just wrap it in it's a smart contractified, whatever it may be, but you wrap it in a Swiss association. I tend to agree that it's not longer, from a sort of a pure conceptual point of view, it's not longer a DAO. Sorry, go ahead, Erik.
Yeah, Andreas, to answer the question of like, how does it interact with the world? So the Shapeshift DAO right now already does this. It owns assets. It owns a whole bunch of Fox tokens, and those are owned in a smart contract, or owned is maybe a weird word here. They're controlled by a smart contract that's set up in a multi-signature arrangement. And for funds to move out of that contract requires the preponderance of the Fox token holders to vote. So the funds move, if we want to fund a project, that happens by a proposal. And if the proposal gets quorum and enough votes, then funds are unlocked on chain and go to the address specified in the proposal. And that's really all you need to do to interact with the real world, as you say. Does that make sense?
Yes, and well, so you don't have any concerns at all about liability, because if you haven't formed a legal entity at all, and then in the past, basically DAOs were considered to be partners. And if you have a partnership, then you have joint and several liability for every partner all over the globe. And that to me personally, that would be a risk that I would probably not want to accept. So,
yeah, the liability question is a totally fair one, and I don't know what the answer is there. But what does it mean to be liable when there are 500,000 partners with all different levels of token and involvement, right? Like, how does the liability unfold, and liability for what, right? Because to be liable for something, there has to be like a duty of service of some kind that was established, or a breach of contract of some kind by one party to another. There is no contract in this case. There is no service being provided under a promise by any entity to any other entity. So I think this is an unanswered question, is how that liability will unfold.
It hasn't been tested, Andreas. I don't know of any case where this has now been tested in court. It would be interesting, but if we take a step back about limited liability, it was also created, and it was created by civil society, not by government, for a need, right? We go back to like the Dutch in the early 17th centuries. They pooled their risk in these ventures where they sent their ships overseas, and the very reason why they came up with the joint stock company, which I like to think the Dutch invented, is because they wanted to limit their risk. And so I have that same question. Aren't we all entrepreneuring, taking gigantic risk by staying unincorporated in a pure DAO form without that limited liability shield around us? And that remains the big question to me as well. If I could just pick up, Erik, on what you say, where does the liability come from? It doesn't necessarily have to be contractual. It could be, for instance, that the SEC does look into the Fox token and start deciding this was a security offering, et cetera, et cetera. I'm afraid that the analysis may well then be, well, who's the lead? Oh, well, everybody associates Erik Voorhees with Shapeshift, and so they may find a way, is probably the answer, unfortunately. Now, then you would have a whole battery of defenses, but I do fear that unless you can do a Satoshi, as I said earlier, that they will find ways to get back to sort of the leads or the founders of a project. That's why instead of the Swiss association, Andres, we quite like the Cayman Foundation, which can be set up without any founders, which can be set up without any members, which we like kind of is a good candidate as a wrapper. If you do need a wrapper around your DAO, we use the Cayman Foundation quite a lot.
Yeah, It's a good point. I think in the SEC question, being a leader of a project is not a regulated activity, right? So the complaint has to be about a specific activity. In the SEC's case, it's usually going to be about the sale of an unregistered security, right? Now, I haven't sold any Fox tokens, and I'm not going to, right? So if and when they come after me, because I have to assume they will, right? Because I have led the project. What
Sounds
will
like
be there?
Your defense is ready already.
Yeah, I've been preparing for this for a while. What will be their specific allegation? You know, that will be very interesting. And I think the point about the liability is a very fair one. You know, anyone involved in a DAO has to realize that there is some liability. It's a question mark. No one quite knows what that is yet.
Totally.
So, I mean, we have kind of answered my last question, but there are quite a few questions lining up on the Q&A. So I'll address them. But the last kind of question I had, you did kind of just answer it. But what do you think is the future of DAOs and regulators' approach to them, worldwide, in the US, everywhere?
Who are you asking?
Any, open to the group.
Okay, I'll go first. It'll probably be different by jurisdiction. It has been the case that regulators are several years behind the curve in all these crypto technologies. There has not been any meaningful enforcement actions against any DAO ever today, and that does not mean that there won't be. There absolutely will be. It might not happen for 2 or 3 years because that's just the speed with which these things occur. The reason DAOs are so interesting is because they fundamentally change the economic relationship between people. And this whole structure of regulation that has been built up for the last 100 years is based around the structure of economic interaction between people that has now been changed. So if I was a regulator, I would look at these DAO things and just be completely confused. I mean, it's confusing enough for people that are in crypto to learn about it, right? Like a year ago, I was totally confused by this stuff. And I think I'm somewhat at the edge of the curve here. So imagine a regulator trying to understand this and then not only understand how it works, but how do you apply their jurisdiction and their law to this strange world that has no conception of it. It'll be really fascinating, and I don't quite know what will happen. I think what we can easily predict is that a lot of projects will say they are decentralized or call themselves a DAO, and they're not. This acronym DINO has been used now, which is good, decentralized in name only. That is obviously rampant, and I think a lot of DAOs start very centralized and become decentralized with time. Certainly that's Shapeshift right now. Shapeshift is an explicitly centralized entity. We will become decentralized with time. But a lot of projects will go on marketing as if they're decentralized, but fundamentally they won't be. And I think those will be huge targets for regulators.
I think there's hope. The example of the fax machine comes to mind. When the fax machine was invented, the US regulators forbade it because they had a monopoly on transmission and US post office and what have you. But everybody started to use the fax machine because people thought it was super convenient to be able to send faxes. So the whole of the business world in the United States used fax machine actually against the law. And there was such a number of fax machines in use that they just had to give up on it. And I think the same is going to happen with the DAO. They're going to have to give up on trying to stop this thing, and they will try because regulators tend to hark back. They don't have the imagination to think how this thing could look like going forward. And so there's that law of numbers that I think will apply. And then secondly, I do think that we're going to go back to a model of contractual limitation of liability, not longer government imposed by chartering a company, but where we here on the call amongst ourselves can actually agree that we all going to have limited liability, and that's going to be recognized. So that's the hope I kind of carry for the future of DAOs.
I think I agree with what was said so far, but I also think right now at the moment, my impression is that the focus of the governments is not on DAOs because there are not so many yet. And nothing negative has happened. It hasn't been abused so far. So I cannot see that there is a specific focus on DAOs of the government, but at the moment. But I think the more the number of DAOs grows, and the moment something happens, somebody abuses it, or somebody suffers damages, then there will be very fast a focus, and they will try everything to put it somehow and squeeze it somehow in their legal system. And so I agree with Erik, maybe in the next 2-3 years, that won't be the case. But as soon as something drastic happens and something abuses it, I think there will be a focus. It was also at the beginning, everybody thought, oh, the blockchain is safe and nobody can abuse it, until suddenly tokens got stolen, and people abused the blockchain. And then suddenly those who were stolen, the tokens, they went to this and said, hey, there has been fraud, my tokens have gone. And then the governments had to deal with it. And maybe at some point in time, something similar happens with the DAO too, or with the activity of the DAO, more or less.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. I'm just looking on the side here. We have loads of questions that are actually coming through for everyone. So I'm going to move on to the Q&A just to kind of get some of these answered, if that's okay. So to start, this one's for Erik. Why has Shapeshift decided to apply KYC in the first place? Was there regulatory pressure? I think this is referring to the discussion point earlier.
Yeah. From Shapeshift's founding in 2014 up to 2018, there was no KYC. And we had that model based on an assumption, well, not an assumption, based on a legal opinion that we got, essentially that because we had no fiat involvement, we were not transacting in currencies, and thus we're not a money service business, and thus did not need to imply or impose KYC. Into 2018, we had gotten a lot bigger, and we dove back into these arguments and spent $1 gazillion on lawyers, only to come to the very miserable conclusion that we may well be considered an MSB, probably would be, and that because we would be treated in that way, we had to act like a bank. And so we would have to implement KYC and all that regulatory stuff. So we put that into Shapeshift in 2018. Obviously, we hated doing that. We believe that people have a right to financial privacy by default. Our customers hated it, and we ended up losing, the vast majority of our business because of it. A lot of the customers just went off to competitors that had existed at that time that weren't nearly as concerned as we were about the regulatory situation in the US. What allowed us to undo that, to remove KYC, which we did earlier this year, even regardless of the DAO announcement, was to no longer do the regulated activity. The regulated activity in this case was being an intermediary to the trade with a customer. By stopping doing that, we weren't doing a regulated activity anymore, and thus the regulation didn't apply. We were only able to still offer the trading through the platform because we integrated DEXs, decentralized exchanges, into the Shapeshift platform, so that when a customer wanted to trade, they're going from their own keys in their own wallet to the DEX. We are not party to that transaction. We are not an intermediary for any moment of time. And thus, if there is a regulatory obligation, it is on the DEX, not on Shapeshift. And the DEX, of course, is just a protocol that can't respond to a subpoena. So not our problem anymore. And that was basically how we moved through that.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So moving on to the next one, how does a DAO engage with traditional finance? So for example, the banks that Shapeshift have existing relationships with.
Yeah, a DAO cannot integrate with traditional finance, at least today. Shapeshift, the corporation, has bank accounts. As Shapeshift, the corporation, is dissolved, those bank accounts get liquidated and closed. They do not convert over to the DAO somehow. And so it's actually not correct to say that Shapeshift, the corporation, is becoming a DAO. The Shapeshift corporation is liquidating. It's going away entirely, including all balance sheet assets, all bank accounts, all contracts, everything. The Shapeshift DAO doesn't need a bank account. It will never hold fiat. It will only hold crypto assets. And if it wants stability, it can hold stable coins very easily. So you know, 3-4 years ago, crypto projects needed bank accounts, and it was always a big pain because banks were so hesitant to ever bank a crypto company. It was a big problem, and we had probably 10 bank accounts closed on us in our history. It's kind of irrelevant now. We don't need it anymore. I think that shows the development of the industry, that banks have now just become completely irrelevant.
Perfect, thank you. So next question, how can a DAO sign a contract with a vendor or a landlord or purchase real estate? So how would it sign an NDA with its lawyer? And what are the means by which others can complain and seek compensation?
If I can pick up on that, Amber, I think we can bundle a couple of questions in the same vein here. I think, Eric, to Eric's point, there are certain things that you can't do with a DAO right now. If the whole legacy world moves on blockchain rails, you will be able to pay for a real estate transaction through a smart contract. There may be some vote either from token holders or, you know, to acquire a property, and then it's going to be self-executing through the smart contract. Right now, that's not the case. So we shouldn't fool ourselves. You can't do the DAO thing for just everything. You can do the DAO thing for instance, yes, a DEX. A DEX works wonderfully out of a DAO. You just have staking in pools. People remain, you know, in control of their staking on staking. But I think a lot of people here seem to ask, hey, how can I sign an NDA? How can I? Well, with a DAO, it's kind of difficult. You've got to think about, okay, what can we organize as an on-chain vote by the pool of token holders? And how can that vote automatically execute by way of smart contract? That, for instance, Otonomos receives a big grant from Shapeshift. Yay! Well, there's been a Fox token, you know, token vote that we, for some reason, we contribute to the future of Shapeshift, and we get a grant out of the smart contract. So let's just be realistic right now. What actually can be done through a DAO?
Yeah, and I think that's important to know as well, because a lot of people don't know what can and can't be done. The same as we discuss liability, you know, it is still kind of open for everyone to, not necessarily open for interpretation, but open for everyone to be understanding at the same pace.
Sure.
Yeah, this brings up an important point here. Like, how does a DAO get an office lease?
Yeah,
it can't. But the more important question is, why does it need one? And the answer is it doesn't. A DAO doesn't need an office lease. A DAO doesn't need NDAs. If a DAO wants to pay a lawyer, it can just send them money, right? So all sorts of things that are done normally by businesses, to the degree that they can't be done by DAOs, the first question should be, well, does it actually need to happen anymore, right? Like the Shapeshift DAO can't file W-2 paperwork for employees, but it doesn't need to. It's not part of that system anymore. And that's why this is really like a fundamental difference in economic organization. And it's not just a new fancy name for an entity that was already existing.
perfect. So sorry, there's so many questions here. I think you guys are all overwhelmed. So I've got another one. Bear with me. So when a DAO is negligent and users of the platform lose their assets, how will they claim it back through legal process? Who should they contact? Now, bringing up this one again, bringing up this kind of point of liability and protection, again, no one really knows where this stands, but do any of you have any kind of insight, or have any of you kind of experienced this, dealing with any companies who have gone through this, or maybe Erik yourself?
Can you read the first part of that question again?
Yeah, of course. So when a DAO is negligent and the users of the platform lose their assets, how will they claim it back through legal process?
Yeah, so can a DAO be negligent, right? A DAO is like a name for a bunch of individuals that are all kind of oriented around generally a token and generally a software project, some kind of web app that's doing something. What is actually being negligent, right? The DAO is not an entity, so the DAO can't be negligent. Was the code negligent? Maybe. Is the liability on whoever wrote the code? Maybe, but there's probably a ton of interesting case law about someone who designs software, writes software, especially open source software that is not commercial. What is their liability for writing that software, even if they produce a catastrophic bug? That's an interesting question, I'm sure, that predates DAOs a lot. Yeah. So you have to be very specific in these questions about who is actually the one who did who made the mistake. And if they made a mistake, do they have an obligation to another party to not make that mistake?
You don't wish anybody to be sued, but it would have been very interesting if the guys from DAO, capital DAO, a couple of years ago would have actually been sued to test that, where they negligent in pushing the code when the DAO got robbed, right? That would have been an interesting, and I'm sure that there's going to be cases like that.
Yeah.
The answer to the question is probably, there was a US president who I think said at some point, who do I call when I need to speak to Europe? And I think it's kind of the same with a DAO. Who do you call? You know, make sure you can't call anybody, that there's no name, contact, whatever, email on your Web3 site. And who do you go after? That's probably the approach.
Like in Shapeshift's case, so I'm the largest Fox token holder, and that's known. What is my involvement? And like, I do not own a majority of the tokens. You know, I own a small single-digit percentage of them. Let's say I do nothing else involved in the open source project for the next 2 years. I go live in a cave and I'm not involved at all. And some horrible bug or issue happens a year from now. What is my culpability, right? I mean, it might be pretty close to zero, and I'm not sure. This is an untested legal question. And there's so much gray area, right? Like if I asked a question on a forum that led to someone doing something which caused the problem, am I liable in that case? I'm not sure. Most ideas have dozens of people involved in their creation and building, and then a totally different team that might be coding it. Where does the liability sit? And I think something that's very important here is that anything in crypto, especially in these early days, users need to go in with a certain degree of personal responsibility that they are not used to in the traditional financial world. They should not be playing around with this stuff without understanding how many bugs can exist, how much money can get lost, because it happens all the time. And anyone who's building these systems needs to constantly be reminding their communities and their users that this is all experimental software, and to be really, really careful.
I thought that going to live in Vail, Colorado is like going to live in a cave.
It's a little nicer than a cave. And
joking,
yeah, I still have internet connectivity.
Joking aside, I you know, we all like that self-reliance component of being in the crypto space, and we need to go back to self-reliance in that respect. So going crybaby when you had some money drained out of a DAO, you know what? I don't think you can actually trace this back or claim this back, but we gotta make sure that we are self-reliant and that we take our precautions, each of us individually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think when someone makes an attestation or a promise that something will work, or that it won't have bugs, or that you won't lose money, when there is a promise like that, then there is legitimate liability if that promise gets broken. But that promise does not exist in the vast majority of crypto finance applications. And so if people want to play around in this stuff, they need to accept that responsibility themselves.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I want to read up on that. For instance, is Tesla making a promise when you buy their car that this is reliable and it's going to work and not explode? I just don't know. It's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, guys. So it's 10 minutes left, so I'll just answer a few more questions and then we'll go. So this one's directed at Han. How do you see the blockchain becoming a recognized jurisdiction?
Yeah, I think it's going to be that law of numbers I talked about before. You know, it's there and it's going to happen. I even see countries existing on blockchain at some point and being recognized. And that recognition is not going to come from the United Nations. That recognition is going to be bottom up. And it's going to be fantastic. We're going to have competing digital realms. And you're going to have a choice if you want to be part of Erik's realm or Andreas's realm. Or actually, it won't even be like Andreas's realm. It will be just a decentralized sort of civil, you know, blockchain. I think it's going to happen because we are going back to privatization of issuance of fiat or currency. I shouldn't say fiat, but currency by way of blockchain. And I believe the same is going to happen. It's between a hope and a belief. So we got to be careful there. But I actually hope that this will go back contractually. Because especially in common law jurisdiction, more than in civil law countries, the courts still pretty much respect when something has been consented between, consenting adults, right? Between contractually agreed. Contract is king still, that tradition is there. So that's kind of the hope that we will be able to get that liability in that jurisdiction on blockchains. Blockchains with S, by the way, it doesn't have to be limited to one blockchain.
Perfect, thank you. And so I'll do, a couple minutes left, so I'll do a final question. Bear with me 1 second. There are so many questions coming through. So we'll finally do, what do you think of infrastructure bill in the US and how will it impact DAOs or crypto in general?
It depends what the final wording ends up being, which no one knows yet. The main contention in that bill, for those who've been following the story, is that there's a new reporting obligation in that bill imposed on brokers to report on all the transactions that they process and to report that to the IRS. On the surface, that doesn't sound that crazy until you realize that they don't define broker, or I should say they define it in such a way as to include everyone in crypto, like including miners and software developers. This is absurd to the point of just being funny, because of course a miner can't report that transaction, right? A miner is processing transactions all the time. They have no idea whose transactions those are. And even if they really wanted to spy on those people, they can't. They don't even have an email address. They can't ask them for their ID, let alone, get anything reliable. So if it goes into law as written like that, it is impossible for a miner and other parties in the US, like software developers or wallet providers, to actually comply. Who knows what will happen, but I know it won't. I know it won't happen. Crypto won't stop moving just because some stupid law gets imposed on it. So potentially it could really harm the US mining industry, and it could put a bunch of cold water on startup companies in the US who are trying to build crypto software. This is yet again a reason why we think a DAO model is better. We aren't a company, and so we can't report on things that we don't have information about. But yeah, it's a big mess, that infrastructure bill, and it demonstrates like how dangerous some of this legislation is that gets stuffed into these bills, and everyone thinks like it's about infrastructure and building bridges, and yet it's actually causing Bitcoin miners to have to report on something they can't do, completely out of the scope of building bridges. But yet that's what's going on.
And it's worrying because it's a trend which ultimately may lead to us being robbed of any form of financial privacy. And I think that is what we have to fight with every fiber of our body, that at some point there will be total surveillance of every financial transaction we do. And so it's kind of a precursor towards where some governments probably want to go. I believe that in China, also by way of the hardware on your phone, where you're going to be permissioned to operate a phone soon, you will no longer be able to have a crypto wallet without fully disclosing who you are. And I think that's very worrying. So that's not the model we should be following.
Great, thanks guys. Andres, did you have anything? Sorry, I wasn't sure if I cut you off.
No, nothing.
No, perfect. Thank you, guys. So on that note, I think it is obviously important to note how regulation is coming into play worldwide. I mean, obviously we saw it over here in the UK with the new crypto assets registration list. It's greatly impacted a number of companies here, those who have been put on the temporary register and those who haven't. Even from that, it was something that hit the UK quite hard, as well as, other countries who also do business in the UK. They're then having to obviously take into account what the FCA is now putting in place. So it's important to note that, it's not just, it's worldwide with what's going on right now and trying to regulate any kind of form of crypto asset businesses. Anything in the blockchain space right now, everyone's trying to get their hands on and put some form of structure in. So yeah, it's been a really good chat today, guys. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, great job, Amber. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I just want to say to everyone, it's NFT time. So just as always on the Pillar webinars, we have a NFT giveaway. So for everyone who participated in our webinar today, if you would just head over to our Discord, the code for today is Let's DAO It. If you follow the instructions on the screen and be quick, there are only 100 NFTs, so it's first come, first served, but head over there now and pick it up. I'll let you get that code and then we'll. So if you want to join us next week for another webinar where the details of the registration will be on the Pillar website, and that's pillar.fi. So yeah, I'd like to thank you all for being here today and all your comments and feedback. If there's any other questions you have, please send them over to the Pillar team and we'll do our best to address them there. So thank you very much, guys. And if you could just take a poll at the end of this for everyone watching, that would be great.
Great, Amber. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys so much. Until next time.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you later.